just like that. No remorse. His thirst for blood just did not end. And this is how evil this man was. The day the renovation had to be complete, the witching hour, Grzimek shows up and he sees Ignacy applying the quick drying varnish on the banister. He puts his hand on the guardrail, Grzimek does, and he realizes that the varnish is not dry. Ignacy explains to him that this is quick drying varnish, and essentially the deadline has been met. Grzimek says no, and has Ignacy taken away to the gallows, along with a shoe cobbler who made Grzimek's shoes just a little bit too tight. That's worthy of a hanging, I think. And the gallows, my grandfather is talks about how he was going numb, and he doesn't remember a lot, but he does remember that Grzimek whispers in his ear, "I let you live another day," while the cobbler is swinging from the noose.
What follows is the extraordinary story of a Jewish man who survived the Holocaust along with his entire family against all odds. The main character of this story is Ignacy Chiger, a man in his early 30s during World War II, living in Lvov, Poland, along with his wife and 2 children. This interview is with his grandson, Doron Keren, who recently published, in English, his grandfather's memoir, Beneath the Lightless Sky, Surviving the Holocaust in the Sewers of Lvov. I felt it was important to be thorough, so the story unfolds slowly at first as Doron and I go back to when Ignacy first wrote his memoir at the age of 69, and then to the beginning of World War II in Lvov. We talk about life before the war, the occupation by the Soviet Union, and then the occupation by Nazi Germany, with the family ultimately going into hiding in the sewers beneath Lvov for 14 months. As the conversation progresses, the scale and horror of the events become almost unimaginable. We talk about the moment Ignacy was nearly hanged by the sadistic commandant Josef Grzimek. We talk about the impossible tasks he was forced to complete under threat of death. We also talk about the constant hiding, the bribes, the narrow escapes, and the impossible decisions a father had to make to keep his wife and children alive. But this conversation isn't only about survival in the sewers. It's about a father's determination to keep his family alive against overwhelming odds. It's about the unexpected humanity of people like Leopold Socha, a Catholic sewer worker who risked everything to help him. And it's about the memory of those who did not survive. One important person in this story is still with us today. Doron's mother and Ignacy's daughter, Christina Chiger, now around 90 years old, who was just a young girl of about 7 during these events. She later wrote her own memoir, The Girl in the Green Sweater. Her memories, along with Ignacy's memoir, help bring this story to life, told through her book and through Doron's recounting of his family's history. The purpose of this conversation is to hear a story that may help us understand what some people endured during one of the darkest periods in history. When we hear what one family went through, the fear, the courage, the moral choices, it may change the way we look at our own lives. So this conversation is about remembrance, but it's also about perspective. I ask that you please forgive me if I leave anything out or do the story any injustice in any way. That is not my intention. I'm simply an imperfect host doing the best to help tell unimportant story. So with that, here's my conversation with Doron Keren. Today's guest is Doron Keren, the grandson of Holocaust survivor Ignacy Chiger. Doron played a central role in bringing his grandfather's extraordinary memoir, Beneath the Lightless Sky, Surviving the Holocaust in the Sewers of Lvov, to English language readers for the first time, released in early 2026. Ignacy Chiger's account chronicles unimaginable courage, his family's 14-month struggle for survival by hiding in the underground sewer labyrinths beneath the war-torn Lvov during the Nazi occupation. In his foreword, Doron describes his grandfather as a real-life superhero, a man who outwitted his captors, protected his community, and preserved a story that might otherwise have been lost to history. Now a retired dentist living in Long Island, New York, Doron has taken on a different kind of calling, helping ensure that his grandfather's testimony reaches a new generation. Through his work, he honors not only his family's legacy, but the enduring importance of remembrance, resilience, and moral courage. So, I was listening to you on another interview, and the way I want to start is I want you to take me back to 1975. Okay. You're around 14 years old. You're in New York. Your grandfather, so Ignacy, was visiting from Israel where he lived at the time. And he was about 69 years old. And he hadn't written his memoir yet. Go ahead and take me to that time and tell me why he started wanting to write his memoir down.
First, I want to thank you, sir, for having me on your show. It's an honor. 1975. It was Forest Hills, New York. My grandparents were visiting, it was an extended visit from Israel. So my grandfather knew a lot of languages, but English was not one of them. So as it happened, my parents took my grandparents to Manhattan, specifically to the Lower East Side. The reason why we were there was to buy a Polish typewriter. Since Polish was his native tongue, he wanted to, at least he can type in a language that was very familiar to him. And he can be extremely eloquent and in choosing the correct words. Honestly, I don't really know exactly what made him decide to write his memoir. I think that it was a combination of a few things. I think it was a combination of his son Pavel was alive, and my mother, his daughter Christina, and then he also had grandchildren, myself and Anat, who's Pavel's daughter. And I think that he realized that if he doesn't get these thoughts down on paper, if he doesn't put these memories down in print, they will just be nostalgia. So it was vital for him to make sure that not only his children and his grandchildren know the story, but I think that this was on a higher level. I think that he wanted the world to know. And that's why, it took him a while to type, but it was so detailed because I don't think he really wanted to miss anything. He originally had some diaries with him when he was in the sewer, but they were lost. I think they were lost when he moved from Poland to Israel. And so he went from memory. And, otherwise it would have been even more detailed.
The book, I have it here.
That's it.
Right. It's a beautiful read. If he wrote this entire book just through memory. There's so many names, there's so many situations. They must have been completely ingrained in his mind.
So I think that trauma does that too, but he was also a genius. He had an incredible mind, knowing, I think, 7 different languages. And I picked up German very quickly, picked up Russian very quickly, knew Ukrainian, Polish. So that was one of his survival skills. And his memory was just, it was like a vault.
I wanted to say the year 1975 was an important year because he didn't live much longer after he finished writing his memoir.
So 6 months later, after he completed his memoir, he passed away. It was sudden. I believe it was a heart attack that took him. He lived a very tough life as an adult. He was around in his 30s at the time, trying to keep alive, 2 children and his wife. A lot of people, a lot of survivors, they survived not as families, they survived on their own. But he was all about the family and making sure that the family survived. So that I'm sure, he was under incredible, incredible stress for many, many years.
It comes across in the book, the way he experiences others that have made different decisions than him. They weren't easy decisions, but he put his family ahead of everything else.
Yes.
In the book, he has some stories where people leave their families, leave their wives, sometimes leave the children. And he would say, I can't understand how people could do that. It was war. It was probably one of the worst things anybody can go through, but he kept to those principles, which is an amazing, encouraging thing. What I'm hoping to do is take this in a chronological order. I want to paint a picture as best we can for anybody listening. He's going to be the main character of this story and what he went through. So let's go to right before the war. He's around 33 years old. We're in Lvov, Poland at that time. Now it's Ukraine, but really just Lvov, which is in today's Western Ukraine. He has a wife. He has a daughter and son. His wife, your grandmother, is Paulina, and he has a daughter named Christina and a son named Pavel. The story takes place over about 3-4 years, but she's basically around 7, 5 to 8, around. But I'm just going to say around 7 during this time. Pavel is, isn't he like 3? He's like a few years younger than Christina. Tell me what his life was like before the war there in Lvov. I believe he had a business. He had his family. He had his parents around. Go ahead and give me that picture.
Well, I think his passion, in fact, I know his passion was to become a medical doctor. He applied to medical school, and he also got the Kaiser Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor you can get as a, I'll say high school student, but their high school was a little bit different than ours. He had all the grades. He had all the qualifications, except there was one problem, and that was, and I can't say it in Latin, but there was a quota. There's a quota of how many Jewish kids can go to medical school. And unfortunately, the year that he applied, he was not accepted because of the quota. So he had to pivot and go work for the family business. And the family business was textiles. And at that time, it's a very robust business. Sewing machines, anything that involved fabrics. So he was a really good procurer. He had a good skill set for supply chain. Other family business was also jewelry. So there was the jewelry side, and that was my grandmother's side. And there was his side, which was the textiles stores. I wouldn't say that they were overly wealthy, but they were very comfortable. They had a beautiful apartment, and it was fabulously decorated. They had a huge grand piano, which my grandmother played. They had a nanny and a housekeeper. So they lived quite well by standards in the early 1930s. So life was great. Life was wonderful. It couldn't be better until it wasn't.
It sounds like he is a successful integration into the family business. He's in procurement, which we'll see later is a good skill to have when Russians and Germans are in control. We'll see later, but he made himself irreplaceable. One of the insights from the book is that he made himself irreplaceable. He learned craftsmanship. He was the leader of men. It seemed like he was always 2 steps ahead, and he was always planning. So definitely an incredibly accomplished, smart man. So that's kind of his life. That picture before the Russians roll in. So I want to give a little history here in World War II. This story involves the Russians. It involves the Germans. So at first, Germany and Russia essentially split up Eastern Europe. So this part in Lvov, the Germans and the Russians agreed that Russia would have it. Okay, first. So, and then later you'll see that Germany attacks Russia and pushes them out of Lvov. So when the Russians move in, Stalin's in power, they have communism. How did things change for Ignacy and his family when the Russians moved in?
Well, that was a wake-up call. It was very abrupt. So I believe it is around September 1st, 1939, when the Germans and the Soviets decided to split Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Essentially, Hitler and Stalin made an agreement to divide Poland in half. And Lvov sat on the cusp of the western part of Poland, west of the dividing line. Once they did that, well, let's go through what happened. Germany invades from the west. The Russians roll through the Polish army and grabbed as much as they could from the east. So Lvov wound up in the Russian territory. You know, there was a period of time, a few weeks, where everybody was hiding. I mean, you indoors in basements, bombs are going off, cities exploding. The Soviets roll in, and essentially everything is flipped on its head. Everything changes. The Soviets come in, and they came in promising paradise, bringing communism to Poland. They came, as my grandfather writes in his book, they came in as liberators, and they liberated us from all our possessions. So one day, my grandfather is going to work, and there is the NKVD, which is today's version of KGB, and soldiers, and they force him to hand over the keys. Not only do they do that, but the employees who were loyal to the family, the Chiger family, oftentimes who had dinner at their apartment, there was a very good working relationship between the employees and the Chigers. They suddenly turned on them as if this was brewing for years and years and years. Suddenly, the Jew hatred came out. People had many different opinions. The wealthy, bored Jewish population thought it was very fashionable to embrace communism. And so they took to the streets and they spread the word how beautiful everything was going to be. Little did they know that it was the exact opposite that was coming. So at the same time, my grandfather would go to his flat, to the apartment, and suddenly there were other people living there. And his, the beautiful apartment that they had was divided up among strangers. They had, I think, about 700 square meters, I think it was, of space. They shared, now they're sharing the bathrooms, they're sharing the kitchen. That created a lot of tension. So strangers are in your house, and in a small space, there's tension in the streets, and there's certainly tension in the apartments as well.
So here he is. He's living with his family, has a successful business. The Russians come in with communism, basically take his business, and then under communism, they assign per square foot how much someone should have in living quarters. And this is wartime, so Lvov's a big city, so people start coming into the city. They start having your grandfather and other people living together in smaller and smaller quarters as there's more people in the city. And that's this huge change for your grandfather and his family. When he gets to that point, he no longer has a business. He no longer has that income, right, that's coming to him. Tell the story of how he starts finding work, how he starts making income to keep his family alive.
Well, first, his wife, Paulina, my grandmother, also worked, and because there was a nanny home, and the nanny took care of the baby, Pavel, at the time. He was born not too long, around the time that the war broke out. And suddenly, the nanny and the house and the housekeeper both decide that, something, we're equal now. I don't work for you anymore. And they left. So half the income is gone because my grandmother has to stay home and take care of Pavel. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world, but now that my grandfather loses his business, he has to go and find work, like everybody else, because everybody who owned a business lost their business. It became property of the state. And essentially, he was kicked to the curb, along with anyone else who owned any kind of business. And he had a skill set, I would say, that qualified him for various types of work. One of them was in what's called a sports cabinet, basically a sports center. My grandfather was pretty athletic and he trained a lot. And so he thought, I'll get a job at the sports center. And he also got a job in some sort of procurement position, procuring goods for a government agency overseen by the NKVD. But everybody's doing the same thing. Everyone's looking for work. And now it's not as if goods are just coming into Poland, to Lvov. Everything that's coming in is being shipped to Russia. But people's spirits were ground into pulp. The mood on the street was suddenly people started to disappear, especially of the intelligentsia class. You had terrible distrust of your neighbor, because your neighbor can give you away to save themselves. And there were spies everywhere. People were put in positions to watch over the occupants of buildings. So you didn't know who to trust. You were always looking over your shoulder. You didn't know what you can say, what you can't say. There was one time when they were sitting in an audience, and this was a propaganda meeting, and they had to attend, but they didn't clap. And so that was really strange for the Soviets, and they interrogated them. So you have got constant stress and tension going on. Um, the Soviets ground you down psychologically. It was less so physically, although they did get pretty rough. But the psychological torment was terrible, and it was vital for Ignacy to try to get enough income to buy this goods that were now scarce. Food was now scarce. It just so happened that, and this was, I think, complete chance, that he was working in a bakery for a short period of time. And I guess the person running the bakery had to hide a substantial amount of food. So he asked Ignacy if he can put the food in his apartment, which Ignacy was very happy to oblige him, even though it was dangerous. But they had enough food to survive for a while. Everything was now about survival.
Yeah, he in the book, when I read, he's in these situations with other people doing similar work as him, procuring things, moving goods from one part of Europe to Russia. And he had a directive from his supervisor, who is Russian, and he is expected to get that done, just like everybody else. But there isn't enough to go around. So, how do you go about accomplishing your goal when there's no one really trusts anybody? People are taking things off the top. People are getting turned in, and there's no trust amongst the people. That was like his first dose of, how am I going to survive this new world that I'm living in. So I think it was perhaps the beginning of his what's more to come. He kind of learned it with the Russians, how to be able to make himself indispensable and useful in the system.
You had to learn very quickly. And he learned the two B's of communism: bribery and blackmail. That's how things got done. And there is a government system, and then there's the real system just below the surface. And so he learned very quickly how to procure goods, which he had to do because otherwise his life was on the line, and his family's life was on the line. And this is how it was. So it's a survival of the fittest and the smartest. And so he became very, very useful very quickly to the head of this industry, and who turned out to be the head of the NKVD in Lvov. So now he's positioned himself as someone who's very useful to the top person in Lvov.
And he has it harder than others, I believe, because he's Jewish, right? So there was a distrust amongst the Jews, right, from the Russians in a way. That's kind of how I understood it. And he was trying to do what these supervisors, these Russians, wanted him to do, but it was even harder for him because of that. Am I wrong there?
No, I think that anti-Semitism existed long before the war started. It was just it became fashionable once the war took once the war began and the new order began. You had Ukrainians who absolutely abhorred the Russians. They also had they also hated Jews. And the Polish were right underneath there. So the Jews had it really, really hard. First of all, they were a minority in their own city. But they would have the distrust of the Polish, the Soviets, and the Ukrainians, and it made it extremely difficult, especially if you are religious and you wanted to continue practicing your religion. So times were really difficult for the Jewish people. Don't forget, there were 150,000 Jews before the start of the war. At the height of the Russian occupation, there were about 200,000, because many Jews fled from Western Poland to Eastern Poland. Because they thought, well, life was probably better under the Soviets than it is under the Germans. Because, they didn't wake up in a bubble. They knew what was coming, what was happening in Germany at the time. You had around 200,000 of Jews in the city. You also had a tremendous amount of, Russian administrators that came into Lvov, because when an army takes over, they bring the administrators. So there are fewer goods, more people, less jobs.
Yeah, they're just so much stacked against anybody living in Lvov, especially the Jews. They had it hardest amongst the group. I wanted to read a quote from your grandfather, from Ignacy here. He wrote here, "Steel is tempered by fire, man by fighting obstacles." I thought that was very succinct and insightful comment that he put in his memoir. So I want to go now to the Germans. Okay, so the Russians are there for a couple of years, I believe, maybe between a year and 2 years, and then the Germans move eastward and overtake Lvov. We talked about how his life and his family's life changed under the Russians. Now, how did his and the family's life change after the Germans came in?
So I want to add one more comment under the Soviet occupation. And that was an observation that Ignacy made when he went to I believe it was a newspaper factory, or a factory that produced paper for newspapers. And he saw this huge machine, and in went all different types of rags and other material. And it went through the process, and out came a beautiful piece of paper. And he said that under the Soviets, it's the exact opposite. The human being gets put into this machine, and out comes an unidentifiable rag of a human being, or just bits and pieces get spit out. I thought that was a really keen observation, how humans are broken down under communism in the Soviet system. So now let's fast forward 2 years, around 2 years. The Germans break the pact with the Soviets, and they steamroll once again. Now they're coming into Lvov. The Soviets are retreating, and the Ukrainians are picking them off in the streets, beating them, shooting them, stabbing them. They're also doing that to the Jews, because not only, they had to blame someone, and of course they blamed the Jews for the Soviets being there. And that is that's the God honest truth. That's what happened. The Poles are kind of ambivalent, but there's a frenzy and chaos and tremendous amount of bloodshed. The Ukrainians wind up doing the Germans' bidding. They, as I write in some of my as he wrote, and I love this word, they just had mordlust. They had thirst for blood. And for all the problems that they had, they blamed the Jews, and of course, the retreating Russians, the Soviets. So they, when the Germans came in, the Ukrainians actually embraced um, the German occupation. The Poles did not, and Jews were absolutely frightened out of their minds. So as my grandfather writes, I think it was the title of one of his chapters, out of the frying pan and into the fire. Now, what was psychological torture and torment became physical, brutal torment and death. Ghettos started to form. In other words, a walled-off city, a walled-off section of the city where the Jews lived. They couldn't cross the walls. They couldn't get in or out. These were always guarded, and wherever there was availability to leave, underneath certain bridges, this was heavily guarded. And the Germans, being very accurate to the people, count every single person leaving and coming back. There was brutality under these bridges and on these crossings. Many people died going in and coming back. So that starts the physical torture of the Jews, and it didn't end. You had what they called actions, and that was a state-sponsored murder event that often involved thousands of people. So it was action after action after action, with a little calm in between, and then an action again. And so Ignacy now has to pivot. He has to think, okay, well, I've got to keep my family alive. And he starts building hiding places for his children. One of the differences between my mother's book and my grandfather's book is that, she saw things through the perspective of a child. And in her world were four walls. She did not leave the apartments, whereas his world was always outside, always moving, always planning, always building. And he eventually was spotted as somebody who knew more than others. He was a really good craftsman and, like you said before, a leader. And he was recognized that by the German high command as someone who the other Jews turned to. So not that he got special treatment per se, but he was recognized as someone that again, he made himself important. He created this persona that he was useful. And he was a fantastic chameleon.
Yeah, listening to, again, him changing, him adapting to this changing environment, right? So the Russians, he had to learn to survive, keep his family alive. And then the Germans come, and now it's a whole new set of rules. It's a whole new set of skills he has to employ and learn to be able to survive. So I read under the Russians, they would refer to him as the foreman, and then under the Germans, they kind of would refer to him as the engineer. Right.
Hauptingenieur, yes.
Mm-hmm. So here he is adjusting again, making himself still irreplaceable, resourceful. He's giving away, trading possessions to survive. He's starting to hide his children by building these elaborate, secret hiding spots for his two children, even his wife. One, maybe you can give an example of a couple of things that he built to hide them, like his wife, I believe, and then in the bed and the children under the window.
So he would build false walls. So if someone came into the apartment, they couldn't recognize that there was a spot behind a false wall that anyone um, was hiding in. From the naked eye, it wasn't visible, and that's how good these spots were. I know that there was a time when Pavel was a baby, or a toddler, let's say, at the time, and my mother, when she heard particular footsteps, I'm kind of mixing up the books a little bit, but that's okay. It's a good effect. This is how, this only helps the story. She knew the difference between a Gestapo boots, that's boots, and regular Wehrmacht. That's how keen her sense of hearing was. Uh, the children were very, very, very well trained to understand and interpret danger. So she would put Pavel underneath the bed inside of a suitcase with little holes so he could breathe. And she would get behind a certain spot which was covered with a curtain, and she would hide there. And of course, you couldn't make a sound. Now imagine a 3-year-old child not making a sound. How does that child know? Well, that's the $64,000 question. They knew what needed to be done. There was another spot that was a false wall where, again, I'm going to mix up the books a little bit, but it's really good to understand what the perspective of my mother as a child. And my grandfather doesn't really talk about this that much, but inside this false wall, you're talking about a space maybe about a foot and a half wide, perhaps even narrow, maybe 3 feet long. There were 2 potties, which my mother and her brother sat on for the entire day, looking at each other. And of course, the potties are there when they have to go, because they couldn't leave the hiding spot. I know I'm jumping ahead, but it's important for people to understand, your audience to understand that. And one of the questions my mother gets often is that, it must have been so horrible, the sewer part, when they lived in the sewer, that must have been the most terrifying time of your life. And she says that it's really not. The most terrifying part was hiding alone in this apartment. Because in the sewer, at least she had her parents. The family was together. Here, the 2 children were alone. And she says, what if my parents were taken off the street? Who would know that they were even there?
Yeah, that is an incredible insight. You hear the story of, Ignacy and his daughter, and you think the worst part would be the sewers, living in the sewer for 14 months. That had to have been the worst. But then here your mom is, Christina, 7 years old, hiding in these secret hiding places that her father built, being completely quiet all day. Imagine like a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old being completely quiet, already trained, and then them worrying all day, will my mom come back? Will my dad come back? What if they don't come back? That has to be a huge, obviously it was her biggest fear during that
Huge trauma,
time.
huge trauma. And didn't just happen once. This was the daily occurrence until the parents came home. Um, my, my grandfather eventually, as the commandants rotated, we can talk about the worst of the worst, if you like.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna definitely get there. I wanted to say during this time, though, he makes mention of many people that were not Jewish that actually helped them survive, right? Soldiers would sometimes come in, discover one of the hiding places, and they would try, of course, you try and bribe them, pay them off, right? And then
Yes.
your last resort, when you're down to just your last resort, you just plead for mercy. And they did have instances of that where some German soldiers didn't turn them in. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So there were many instances where German soldiers and mostly the SS and Gestapo and all. I need your audience to understand the difference between regular army and the Sonderdandskommandos, the SS and the Gestapo. Those were police, effectively. They were Jew hunters. That was their job. The soldiers were regular army, the ones who rolled through and occupied Lvov and most of Europe. There was one particular incident when a SS officer came into the apartment, and he was accompanied by a Ukrainian man, a Ukrainian militiaman, and bribes were offered. The SS officer said, "Okay, bleiben Sie, bleiben Sie." That's like, be gone. I've had enough. But the Ukrainian insisted that no, we need to take them. By taking them, he meant we need to kill them. And so ultimately, my grandfather would offer the Ukrainian even more and more and more. That's some of it was luck. I imagine it wasn't that way for many Jews. But luckily they had the resources still to be able to pay off the Germans and the Ukrainians, and to live another day. And there was a situation where one of the best hiding spots, I mean, just off the charts, incredible, hiding place, right under the commandant's nose, right under his office. Ignacy built a fabulous bunker with electricity, water, guns, food, and working toilet. And it's a marvelous work. And it only was by accident that it was discovered. And unlucky for Ignacy, they complimented him like it was a work of art. They couldn't believe how incredible this and sophisticated this hiding spot was. But one of the problems was that they were caught. And once again, the Germans were like, well, let's, they needed a bribe. My grandmother would cook eggs with onions for the soldiers. And so they were pleased. Their bellies were full, and they're like, whatever. Of course, one of them said, you know what? We're going to take one of the kids. We're going to take Pavel, meaning you'll never see him again. He's going to be killed. And Ignacy at that point said, you know what? Why don't you take all of us? Because you're not taking him alone. You're not separating him from us. And then something must have snapped in the German's mind. And he said, okay, well, you know what? Here you go. He's back with you. He could have easily gone the other way and killed the whole family. But, this is some of the luck. And, many things, he created his own luck. He created, using his charm and wit, but sometimes luck was just luck.
Yeah, he seems to be able to convince people to do the right thing a lot of times. He did it with that soldier. He was willing to sacrifice his entire family for his son. And I just wanted to give one more example of someone helping someone helping the Jews out that your grandfather Ignacy mentions. I thought it was interesting, so that's why I'm bringing it up. There was this German secretary. He describes her as a young, beautiful lady who had the eye of one of the commandants of the ghetto. Her name was Fraulein Andre. I'm not sure exactly how you say it.
Fräulein Andrea.
Jolene Andrea.
Fräulein, yeah.
Fraulein Andrea. She had the eye of Siller, who was commander of the Gulag at that time, and he writes that he was a murderous type.
Yes.
He was smitten with Fraulein, and he befriends her and asks for her help, and she agreed. So he says that when Siller would become upset and wanted to kill some Jews, a lot of Jews would come to him and say, how are we going to save their lives? There was an example when he said that there were a couple of Jews that he wanted to kill within an hour. He go, they're going to die in an hour. So he called her and he spoke to her, and he did this several times, he said, and he begged for her to intervene. And she did. She calmed him down in only a way a woman can. He doesn't go into it much, but it's obvious in the book.
It's obvious.
And he writes this of her: if Fraulein Andre is still alive somewhere, we should pay tribute to her courage and helpfulness towards the Jews. If she has already left this world, hail to her memory.
Yes. She was one of the good people who, valued humanity. And you needed those. You couldn't survive without some of those people, as obviously we'll talk about later on.
Now I want to talk about an important character in your grandfather's story, Josef Grzimek. Okay? In 1943, he became the commander in Lvov of the Gulag. He was the most brutal, per Ignacy. He would be tried in Warsaw in 1949 for what he did there. Your grandfather would actually testify at that trial.
Yes.
So tell me about the first time Ignacy met Grzimek.
So this is fit for television. I couldn't get any better than this. This is Quentin Tarantino-esque. A 6.5-foot man stands up riding in on a quadriga, essentially, a horse-drawn carriage. I think they call it a brishka. That's another name for it, where the carriage is low and the wheels are tall and wide. And he's riding in with a submachine gun in one hand and a whip in the other. Full regalia, SS uniform, shining black, very ominous looking. And this is the beginning of, as my grandfather writes, Grzimek's kingdom. As he rides in, literally the street cleaners are there to greet him. Jews basically with knocking knees. You can imagine them urinating on the spot. they were so frightened. And my grandfather made one critical error, and that is that he spoke out of turn, or he spoke back to Grzimek during that scene. And Grzimek, and I never knew this until I read this. Never knew. My grandfather was blind in one eye for as long as I remember him. I never knew why. I thought it was because he used to box with me and, play fight, whatever, teach me how to box. I thought it might have been from that, but no, it was Grzimek's whip that crushed his eye socket when he spoke out of turn. As he bled in the street, reeling in pain, that was his introduction to Grzimek, Josef Grzimek, SS Hauptstandbannführer, Josef Grzimek. May have gotten that right. Not sure.
I think he writes that Grzimek wanted him to clean the streets, and Ignacy was saying, I mean, we can do that, but we can do so much more. We have the skills to be able to build things, to construct things. And that's what his speaking out of terms incident was. Is that right?
I think so. I think that Grzimek was obsessed with cleanliness and order. I mean, I think that at one point, Ignacy writes that you can literally eat off the streets in Lvov. That's how clean they were. Now, Grzimek played this horrific, sadistic cat and mouse game with Ignacy. He recognized Ignacy, and he's the one who gave him the moniker of engineer. He seemed to recognize the fact that he was a leader, and people turned to him. So naturally, he turned to him, and when he wanted things done. And he would give Ignacy these almost impossible tasks to complete, knowing that if he failed, he would have killed him on the spot. But he completed every one of these tasks on time in a way that impressed him so much that he showed off all the things that Ignacy and all the other craftsmen and tradesmen would build to his Nazi buddies.
I want to go over some of those, actually. So Grzimek would give certain Jewish men a task that he knew was basically impossible or very, very difficult. And if they didn't complete it, they knew they were going to die. And he gave, Ignacy several of these. And let's go over a few of them.
Well, because he was so obsessed with cleanliness and order that Ignacy had to invent a machine that would clean the streets. So he used, and by the way, it's not like there's a Home Depot right around the corner or a Lowe's. You have to scrounge around and get whatever you can get, and then also take a chance at crossing beyond the ghetto walls into the non-Jewish section of Lvov. And he was able to do all of that. He became, wonderful at physics, right? That was another skill set that had to be acquired out of necessity. And they invented this machine that would spin a barrel and water would come out, and there were valves and pressure gauges, and it was essentially a spread water out of the back of the wagon and clean the streets. That was one, and that was I think that was the first task. Then there was the task to create a dining hall and kitchen area that would entertain, I think, hundreds of his Nazi friends. And of course, you can imagine how long something like this would take. Knocking down walls, in a long long building a kitchen on one end and a dining hall on the other, with painted tiles and polished floors. I think they had, 24 hours to complete that?
24 hours. Yeah. 24 hours.
24 hours. But they got it done. And when the food was served and his friends came, he would ask, how long do you think that it would take to build such a grand hall? And they said, well, probably a couple of months to get it all done. No, my Jews built it in 24 hours. That's what. And so he, not only was he an obsessed person, but he also relished in the fact that he can push Ignacy to the very edges and still get everything accomplished. And he played that cat and mouse game, toyed with him, knowing that, he can kill him at any time. The final task was just, that was just, that again, Quentin Tarantino-esque. This is unbelievable. When he asked them to renovate a townhouse on the edge of the ghetto, that was going to be his place where he was going to live, and complete with security cameras and lights and guards, and everything had to be redone. And Ignacy, at the very end, no, let's go back a bit. 3 straight days of work. All these laborers are working as hard as they possibly can. They're also, it's not like they're fed very well. They eat scraps. They don't consume a lot of food, but they're working incredibly hard and without rest. They decide to take a break for a second. The sun came out, and so they decided to put their faces in the sun. And Grzimek comes out with his girlfriend, and he puts the barrel of the rifle on Ignacy's shoulder and proceeds to kill everybody who was sitting down and looking in the sun. Just like that. No remorse. And, his thirst for blood just did not end. And this is how evil this man was. Not only did he psychologically torture Ignacy, it was physical as well. So the day that the renovation had to be complete, the witching hour, Grzimek shows up and he sees Ignacy applying a varnish, quick-drying varnish, on the banister, which he had to get, jump through hoops to get, cheating death constantly. He puts his hand on the guardrail, Grzimek does, and he realizes that the varnish has not dried. Ignacy explains to him that this is quick-drying varnish and that it will, dry in minutes. And essentially, the deadline has been met. Grzimek says no, and has Ignacy taken away to the gallows, along with a shoe cobbler, who made Grzimek's shoes just a little bit too tight. That's worthy of a hanging, I think. And the gallows, my grandfather is talks about how he was going numb, and he doesn't remember a lot, but he does remember that Grzimek whispers in his ear, "I let you live another day," while the cobbler is swinging from the noose.
This man was so evil. When you hear what he did to your grandfather and others, obviously, it is extremely evil. I mean, he put the gun over Ignacy's shoulder and killed the Jews he did that obviously on purpose so that he could show him his true power and hatred for the Jews. And then I want to add a little more to the story there. When he takes him to the gallows, he strips him naked.
Yes.
And your mom, Christina, so his daughter, is up in the buildings, and there's a ruckus, and people are like, "Oh, someone's going to be hanged," and she's looking with her
palms.
mom.
Yeah.
Your mom is like, don't look, but she sees it's her father being stripped down, is going to get hung, and then Jimmick puts him all the way to the very end, and then you realize that he was just toying with him that entire time, just this mental game, playing with him.
Imagine the scene of a naked man walking through a crowd, so numb that he doesn't even realize that he's naked. And then Grzimek, says something about, well, you don't want to just walk around with your, penis swinging around. Put on some clothes.
Yeah.
Again, sick, demented beast. It's incredible that these characters existed. I mean, you read about it and you're like, is this real? Is this person actually real? And yeah, I mean, it turns out that evil is real.
I want to add some history here. Grzimek was tried in a 3-day trial in Warsaw from January 28th through January 30th of 1949. Survivors of the Holocaust testified against him, including Ignacy, whose testimony helped document the crimes committed against Jews. At the conclusion of the trial, the court found Grzimek guilty and sentenced him to death. Grzimek was executed by hanging. The situation was so desperate that I was reading there, and he mentions, and perhaps it's well known, but I didn't really know about it, but cyanide, right?
Right.
Many Jews would carry around cyanide, and if they were going to be executed or sent off to camps, they would take the cyanide and end their life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
When he talks about cyanide, he refers to Paulina, his wife, who had cyanide, I guess, stuffed in her shirt or in an inconspicuous place but a place that she can reach for it and give it to the kids and take it herself. And there were several times that she literally was reaching for it. And that could have been the end. But she didn't, obviously. But that was what Jews had. Instead of being taken away or shot in the street, they would rather just take the poison and end their lives and not let the Germans have that satisfaction. This was a blood sport for the Germans to kill Jews. My mother talks about some trauma in her life. And, when I was growing up, I heard bits and pieces of these stories. I never really had a chronological idea or order of things until I read her book and until I read even deeper understanding of what was going on when I read Beneath the Lightless Sky. So this was just absolutely inhumane treatment of Jews.
Your mom mentions, I think I heard you talk about, she could be startled easily.
So if there's a sudden thud, I'm banging on my desk right now. But that type of a sound could startle my mother, probably to this day. And that was the sound of mothers throwing themselves off of the roof of their buildings onto the pavement. That's a sound of bodies hitting the pavement, because they would come home after working insane hours and find that their kids were taken. They came to home to an empty apartment, and they didn't have anything to live for at that point. There was no one left to save, so they threw themselves off the roof to their death. And that sound is, again, that thud sound is bodies hitting a pavement. And my mother remembers that very well.
So on May 30th, 1949, the walls were closing in. Each one of these actions by the Germans, the ghetto would shrink and shrink and shrink, and your grandfather, along with the other ones that have survived, were luckier and luckier and luckier to have survived. So on May 30th, 1949,
43.
I'm sorry, 43. So on May 30th, 1943, Grzimek organizes a theater performance in the gym surrounding the gulag, the ghetto. There was SS, Gestapo, Ukrainian militia, and trucks. And the Jews knew this was the final act. And this precipitated with your grandfather going into the sewers. Can you talk about that time and how he planned around going to the sewers and then ultimately going down there?
Yes. So my grandfather knew the end was coming, and they needed to escape. They needed to get out of the gulag or gulag. But how? And for how long? So he remembered that when he was a teenager, after the First World War, he sat on a hill and he watched Italian prisoners build what was called the Peltva sewer. It was literally an open sewer river running through the city, but the construction of the vaulting to close the sewer and then build a road on top of it, that was done by those soldiers. And he watched this being done. So he thought, what if we access this river underneath the streets, the sewer, and we could escape through there out into an area and wait out the storm. And of course, he didn't know for how long that would be, but at least they would be safer in that confinement than they were in the confinement of the Gulag, which was effectively a death sentence. So he knew from memory that there was a particular building, they called it a barracks, which was closest to where the sewer, the Pulver River ran. And he calculated, now here comes his physics. If he dug through the basement of that barracks at a particular angle and a particular distance, he would be able to get to the bottom of the vaulting. Now, again, you have a vaulted ceiling, and you had a pathway on either side, maybe about 18 inches wide. The vaulting at the height was 7 meters. And the only way to do that was to dig through the basement of this barracks. So the person who lived there, turns out, was one of the people that went down into the sewer. And he got to that person through another man who knew him. So it turned, he had to figure out who lives in what building. Can I trust this person? Will they help? They dug For 2 days straight, they dug a tunnel. Maybe it was 2 feet wide around and 4 feet high. And they dug this tunnel, and they hit the concrete vaulting. Now, the concrete vaulting is almost 3 feet thick of foreign concrete. 8 days it took them to break through that concrete vaulting. And lo and behold, they wound up just above the walkway of the sewer. Now, if they dug too high, the angle was too low, they would have been on the top of the vaulting and they would have wound up in the river, drowning. Dug too low, they would have been underneath it. So once again, using his skills, his memory, his quantitative analysis, Ignacy dug the perfect tunnel, constructed the perfect tunnel, and they were able to enter this sewer through the hole that they made. And this was one of the scariest moments he mentions of his life, that it was complete darkness. They had no idea, what they were getting themselves into.
So this is happening, this digging is happening before this gym event, when it was the final
Yes.
action. He was preparing because he just probably knew it was coming.
Again, it was fortuitous. Correct.
The way I picture these this area is, I picture like a subway with like a rounded top, and instead of a train, there's a raging river
Yes.
with 2 small levees on the side where you can walk. But I think it's like 16 inches wide. But if you fall into the river, you're a goner, right? A lot of people died if you fell
They
into
would
the
slip
river.
and fall into and as it turned out, his uncle, no, his brother-in-law. I'm sorry.
Brother-in-law died, yes.
Yeah, that way.
Mhm.
So again, it's one confinement substitute for another. But before this, Ignacy built a false wall again down in the basement where the family was hiding. So if anybody came down there, it wouldn't look like there was anything happening behind the wall. As luck would have it, one day when they were down inside the pelfa, they saw light, and then they heard voices, and it turned out that someone spotted them and was calling towards them, that they were so frightened. This was their first encounter with Leopold Socha and the other sewer workers. Leopold obviously was taken aback, thinking, what did you do to my vaulting? But at the same time, incredibly impressed. And quick-witted as Ignacy was, a deal was struck. Money for food and shelter. And that's how the relationship started. Leopold Socha was of the lowest station in life. He was a petty thief, in and out of prison most of his life. He was a sewer worker, obviously working in the lowest point, literally. But something came over him, and this was a combination of several things. He came up through the hole where they dug, and he came up into the basement, and his beautiful, round face with big white teeth was a shock to my mother, her brother, and Paulina. But when he saw them and he saw this desperate family, something turned in him. He pivoted it wasn't just transactional. This was he was a very pious person, and he was a good Catholic. He went to church, and he saw this as a redemption. Eventually, he saw this, it didn't just happen overnight, but this was his way of getting into heaven. And Ignacy recognized that. And he knew that he can trust him, and that this man, had a mission that he was going to accomplish. When the money ran out, that's when he showed his true colors. That the others didn't want to come back, but he was going to see this to the very end.
Yeah, his story is he's obviously a extremely important person in Ignacy's life. Socha works in the sewers. He's in his late 20s, is kind of what I believe his age was. In and out of jail, like you said. He works down in the sewers. He runs into your grandfather, and he's like, "What are you guys doing down here? How did you get here?" Um, he has a soft spot in his heart, perhaps because of his history for the Jews. He's Catholic. An important part, I think, to mention is that he had a wife and a daughter.
Yes.
And he had a daughter that I think was a couple years older than your mom, than Christina.
Yes. She was a teenager, maybe an early tween.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So he goes up and he sees that this man, Ignacy, has a family. He has a wife. He has a daughter a little bit younger than his, and a son. And he's a father trying to do the best he can for his family. And no one will ever really know, but I like to think that drew him, that pulled on his heartstrings. And the way I see it is, up to this point in Ignacy's life, he was the primary, God and luck and him were keeping the family alive. He was doing everything he could. And then when Socha comes into the picture, he has a connection with your mom as being like a daughter to him. And he, as the story continues, is always having your grandfather, your grandmother, and his kids at the top of his mind. He would do anything he could within his power to keep them alive. So I think your mom is actually a key to to survival at this point, one of the biggest keys, because of that association with his daughter. I don't know, I have a daughter myself, kind of around that age, and I could see, I'm Catholic as well, but I could see myself just being completely pulled in and not wanting anything bad to happen to this family.
As much of a criminal that he was, he had a huge heart, and a huge heart for my mother, Pavel, and my grandmother as well. He worshipped my grandfather. He knew that this man was a smart man, and he had a great respect for him. But he loved my grandmother and my mother and my uncle. He saw them as his second family. His first family was up on top, and that was Wanda, his wife, and Stefcha, his daughter. Initially, Wanda did not want to help, wanted to give them up, because, you can imagine how dangerous this is if you're hiding Jews. But he was so determined to save this family that he actually threatened his own wife. And There was a time when my mother became very melancholy. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't react to anybody. And he took her to a particular place in the sewer where he can pick up the manhole a bit, and then she could breathe fresh air and see some light and understand that there was life still out there for them. And he would tell her just a little while longer, just a little while longer. And this broke her out of that funk that she was in. It's incredible how adaptable people can be. I find this to be one of the greatest attributes. My mother would say that too. Wasn't always the brightest or the wealthiest or the strongest. It was the people who were the most adaptable to the situation at hand that survived. Of course, luck has a lot to do with it. But what does it take after all of this, and you're reduced you move from apartment to apartment, and you're reduced in the amount of space that you have, and you're sleeping on top of strangers and sharing bunks with very little food, and in the worst possible conditions, to make a decision to go down into a sewer filled with rats, filth, excrement. The smell must have been suffocating. What does it take for a human being to decide that this is where I'm going to seek refuge? You must be in such a situation. I mean, this is you're pressed against the corners to do this, to survive. Many didn't. Many who went down, 20 went down into the sewer in the frenzy when the ghetto was being liquidated and what it was left of the gulag was on fire. Desperate people went down with them. Some, opened manholes and wound up with this group. There was a lot of chaos going on in the very beginning. And so it went down to a group. I think it started to like 70 something. And Socha knew that there's no way they could possibly, keep this many people alive. And so the group whittled down to about 20. From that, only 10 survived. Some people couldn't take it after some time. And they thought, I think that he mentions, they dreamt of strawberries and cream.
Mm-hmm.
And they went up top and they were murdered.
Yeah, they go down into the sewer. They run into Socha. This is before kind of the final action, and they have a plan. The final action occurs, and they go down into the basement. They go down into the sewers, and they were working on a place that was going to be their home until they figured out what to do next. And there were so many people that were coming behind them. Everyone was panicking, and it turned into a huge group. And Socha, when he encounters the huge group, he's like, I can't help this many people. I mean, there's no way. And he had to whittle down the group to a manageable amount and takes them to another part of the sewers, where ultimately they find a place called the Palace, that your mom writes about, where they stayed for most of the 14 months. They describe the sewers as there are lots of cobwebs everywhere, extremely dark. There was excrement, mold. Your mom says there were lots of worms around, rats, which ultimately they lost the fear of, and they became almost like pets and friends. It was cold. There was mud, and it was cramped. They didn't plan to be there that long, but as one day leads to the next, it's the safest place for them. People would escape from the sewers and get killed. They would hear of like people dying when they escaped, or they would jump in the river and try and escape and they would drown. When they were down there to get water, I thought that was such a Herculean,
wasn't it? Incredible.
yeah. Just for imagine you're with 20 people and you have to drink water. So, can you explain how they fetched water in the sewer?
So he crawled through an 18-inch pipe for over a mile through filth, and you can imagine what kind of stuff was in the pipe. Yeah, and these are all tributaries from the main sewer system. Stuff is coming in from everywhere, and all to fill up a tea kettle that he held. It was wrapped with a fabric, and he just clamped down with his teeth, and then had to crawl backwards through this same pipe. I mean, what is 18 inches? You know, the normal man is not going to be able to fit through something like that.
He crawls 18-inch pipe all the way there, about a mile, carrying it in his mouth, crawls backwards those same distance for a small amount of water. I was reading, each person, their ration was 3/4 of a cup of water per day. And someone had to do this every day, because that was the cleanest water, right? That
Right.
they could drink.
Until they found the palace, and I think that they were able to get water through a different path.
Right. Yeah, but initially that was the route. That was the challenge. On one of these trips, Ignacy's brother-in-law died. I want people to know that it wasn't perfectly safe down there. And Ignacy felt guilty about him dying. Can you give that part of the story?
So his brother-in-law cheated fate twice. The first time when they went down, he slipped and he fell into the rushing water, and Ignacy reached for him. I think he might have used a belt to throw to him, and unfortunately lost the rucksack with all of the essential tools and stuff that they came down into the sewer with. Their possessions were gone, but he saved his life. There was another time where he slipped and fell again, and the third time, Ignacy was supposed to go to get water, and he went with another fella. He was supposed to go with another fella, but his brother-in-law says, "No, I'll take your turn," and he did, and he fell in, and he drowned. So he didn't cheat fate then, and Ignacy felt incredibly guilty, and he loved his brother-in-law, a great deal of respect for him, and I think that was the first death in the sewer, the first loss. There was another situation, and I tried to really picture this, and I read it over and over again. Paulina and the kids, and during a period of time when there was a lot of chaos, they were running away from, I think, someone that might have spotted them through the sewer tributaries, and she fell. I think she was wearing these big clogs because her feet were so swollen, and she tripped and fell and blocked a pipe that they were going through. Now, water was coming, and so I think the pressure of the water was building up behind her, And Ignacy writes, you know, what a way to die. What a stupid, stupid way to die, of all things. And as luck would have it, uh, Socha and his buddies, they found her and they uh, hoisted her up, um, and the water receded, and so they cheated death. But that was one of those. This is one of these events where you slip, and suddenly, everything goes to shit, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak.
Yeah.
And this is not an easy place to walk. It's slippery. It's you're literally, it's not like it's lit up. You're walking by feeling almost. And I know that my mother said, that she kept slipping with her outside foot, uh, almost falling into the river. And they would hold on to each other as they would walk. Um, what a situation. Just insane. And then they come upon a place finally that my grandmother coined the palace. Socha said, what about this place? It's dry for the most part. It's big enough where you have a little bit of room to move around. And she says, this is a palace. And he was so proud and he was so happy. Happy that she was happy.
Yes, because I think your grandfather said, Ignacy said, he said he was happy with it, but he goes, it really, my opinion really doesn't matter. It's Paulina that's the important decider, and she said it was a palace. Can
Yes.
you describe can you describe how big it was, how tall it was, what it was like a little bit?
So it wasn't very tall. As a matter of fact, I think it was maybe about 4 feet at the height. And no adult could stand up fully erect. They were always hunched over. And what they did was they had brought in, it was, there were two different sections. There was a section where they erected beds from planks that they had found along the way. And then during the day, they would disassemble them and they were able to sit. But at night, they would reassemble and they would sleep, um, you know, next to one another. Um, and then there was an area where they can kind of like do their business, so to speak. And what was amazing is that, and this is amazing about the human psyche, a routine was formed. Once they decided that this is the place that they're going to stay and hunker down, they got into a routine. Everybody had a job. They had uh, their morning, afternoon, and evening was set. And uh, Ignacy, once again, now wanted to feel like human again. And so he wrote satire, and they put on plays, and they would make fun of each other and write poetry and to feel human, just a little bit of humanity, just a little human, to feel what it was like to have some sort of normalcy.
Yeah, I think it's important for people that people will probably be curious as to how they, their routine was like, and I'm glad you brought that up. Like you say, it was around maybe 4 feet high. I read it was somewhat like an L shape where they would use one section to go to the restroom, and everyone was spread out otherwise. Soha would come, it sounds like daily, with food or different things that they would need. So they would look forward to that every day, and he would sometimes stay with them for some time. I want to talk about there was a young woman there amongst the group that was actually pregnant, right? Can you give that part of the story?
So you imagine if you're going down into the sewer and you're not going down there with a suitcase, whatever your possessions are, you're wearing them. So she had a big coat, and this woman, Janya Weinberger, she, before descending into the sewer at some time, she gave up her daughter to and someone on the Aryan side, or the non-Jewish side, and she had no idea what happened to her. But she went down, and she was pregnant, but she didn't tell anybody. And eventually, she couldn't not tell anyone. uh, and she gave birth. Once again, Ignacy's role changed. He became a midwife and helped birth this child. I mean, having a child in the sewer not only is difficult to give birth, but this was very dangerous because a child cries. I mean, a baby, a newborn will cry for food, and the cries would give them away because sound travels. The mother knew this, and as much as they tried to keep the baby alive, the mother suffocated her own baby in order to save everybody else. So you can imagine, you give up one daughter, and then you have a child, and you kill your own child.
That is such a sad, sad part of the story. I remember as a child when someone would bring up the hypothetical, that exact hypothetical, and I never knew of anyone that had actually been through it. Your grandfather's, so Ignacy's, he understood why she did it, and your mom, she was a child, right? She says that she was looking forward to playing with the baby. So they give two different perspectives on this extremely sad situation. I thought that was
Right. My
insightful.
mother, number one, she's a child, and so her motherly or womanly instincts came out. And so it was a very emotional time for her. And it was such a very, very tragic time. Again, looking forward to playing with the baby. Whereas my grandfather, it was almost like a matter of fact, like, okay, like your mother did the right thing. We wrapped up the baby and we sent it down into the river. End of story. Matter of fact, a tragedy, yes, but we have to move on.
Let's talk about your mom also had another fear of drowning. They had an incident down in the sewers. Could you talk about that?
So during the winter months and beyond, there was a lot of water in the sewer. And when it rained, there were torrents of water. And at one time, there was so much water that the men actually had to use their backs to deflect the water away from the area that they were, living in or hiding in. But the water would still come up, and it would come up, and it would come up, and it would come up, to the point where my grandfather would have to hold up the children up to the ceiling of this pipe. And my mother was so scared that she was going to drown. There was one fella who was religious. His name is Berestiki. And she she asked him, please pray, pray, pray that the water recedes, pray that we'll live. And ultimately the water did recede. But this frightened her so very much. So again, the sound of, a body hitting the pavement and the sound of rushing water really triggers her to this day. And you can imagine, the PTSD associated for something like that. You don't have to be in combat. You just have to be in a horrible, horrible situation where you're facing death.
So let's talk about when they exited the sewers. So the Russians start making gains on the Germans, and then word starts getting out that they may be liberated. And then one day the Russians finally overtake and are occupying Lvov again. Go through what happens when they exit the sewers, what it was like, what they said, and then some of what happened right after.
So interestingly enough, my grandfather writes that the moment they were all waiting for, he almost missed because he was exhausted and he fell asleep. At the point where Socha was rapping on a manhole near them, yelling for them, come out, come out. It's safe to come out. And he almost missed it. Well, he missed that moment. He talks about it, but he was sad that the one time that he really would have loved to be awake, he was asleep. But moving on from there, Socha had led them through the pipes to an area, to a ladder where they can climb out into a square courtyard between buildings, and he told everybody, the order in which they want to come out, that they should come out. And the last to come out, he said, and the last person to come out is Ignacy, the captain of the ship. He was also known as the superintendent. But at that moment, he was the captain. And here's the strange thing. So this ragtag group, and now there were only 10, started with 20, there were only 10 left, that came out. They really couldn't see anything. The light was unbearable. Their eyes were not used to the light. And so they saw in orange or yellow. Everything was like a silhouette. They couldn't make out anything. Pavel, interestingly enough, remember, he's a very, very small child. He's screaming and crying that he wants to go back home. He wants to go back into the sewer because that's the home he knows. He doesn't remember being anywhere else. And so to him, this is like landing on another planet with Martians. It didn't make any sense to him. Eventually, they talked him into it, that it's okay, and so he grabs onto the leg of one of the Russian soldiers. Now comes the real interesting part, and this is where the angel Socha, this is what he's been living for, what he's been working for 14 months. He was so proud that he said, look around. He gathered people around and he said, this is my work. I did this. These are my Jews. I saved them. And I get really emotional every time I even say that, because his love for this family was just off the charts. And, my grandmother swore to her dying day that Socha was an angel sent from heaven. And why is that? I mean, well, he appeared out of nowhere. He saves this group. He saves this family. And then, tragically, a year after he saved them, he was killed by Russian soldiers. His body lay over a sewer grate, and his blood ran into the sewer. So when God, said it was time to come up to heaven, he took him. And whether you are religious or not, I think that there's something to that. I really do.
We should say that he was, I think, hit by a drunk Russian
Yes.
soldier,
Yes.
and he died, and his blood went into the sewers. Yeah.
Yes.
How is it's important to say, I feel, how does the Jewish community recognize Socha today?
So Socha is recognized as the righteous among the nations. And if you go to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, in Israel, last I checked, there were 12 tributes, 12 cases, let's say, glass cases, and his was one of them, right opposite Oscar Schindler. So he's in good company. And righteous among the nations is a title given to people who were not Jewish who saved Jews during the Holocaust. And he was recognized as one of them, which is an incredible honor.
Got just a couple of wrap-up questions here.
Sure. Yeah.
One thing that I've heard you talk about was in Lvov, there were 150,000 Jews, and in the end, I think 260 survived, your family included. I did some math on that, okay?
So did I.
And I tried to come up with a way to explain to people how improbable that number is. Flipping a coin, okay? Do you know how many times you have to flip a coin? Let's say you want heads, okay? You're going to call heads, and you're going to flip a coin. Do you know how many times you have to flip that coin on heads to get the odds of going from 150,000 down to 260? It's 9 times, okay? A little over 9, but basically 9. So if you have a group of 1,000 people around, you can say, everyone pull out a penny. Or if they don't have a bunch of pennies around, everyone stand up. Okay, everyone flip a coin. Okay, and then if you got tails, sit down. And if you have heads, great, flip again. Again, you're going to have half the people sit down, half the people sit down, half the people sit down. And if you can do that 9 times, if someone wants to try it for themselves, if you get a tail, you're dead. You're gone. Those odds are so incredible.
So I created a odds funnel, a little different. 150,000 Jews before the war. 260 survived. One family, one nuclear family with 2 kids. My family. What are the odds? If you lived in Poland proper at the time, as a Jew, you had a 10% chance of survival. If you were in Auschwitz, as a Jew, you had a 12% chance of survival. My family's surviving Lvov was 0.016%. That's 1 out of 6,280. So I'll just touch upon this point because I think it's rather interesting, and it's divine intervention. And if you recall, in the ghetto, or in the Gulag, there was a seance that took place by a psychic who didn't survive. But he pointed to two people that would survive when they have this seance with a bunch of people. It was my grandmother and my grandfather. You have the situation with the angel, Socha, how he literally, came out of nowhere, helped his family, and then was taken to heaven when his job was done. There are so many times where Ignacy, instead of going down the stairs, he went up the stairs. Where they lived, they had two different doors at one point in time, two different entrances, and the Germans skipped over one entrance. I can go on and on and on, but it seems like there was more than just luck. When you have a 0.016% chance of surviving, it's got to be more than just luck. It just has to, and there has to be something more than more than what's earthly, I think.
Absolutely. I think I agree with you there. I want to finish off the picture of the story a little bit. After the war, they moved into a little bit further into Poland, and then ultimately to Israel, where you were born, and then your grandparents stayed in Israel, and your mom and you came to New York, where she was a dentist, and then he came to and from to visit, but he ultimately passed in Israel.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So he published his memoir in Polish in the past, right? In the 70s or 8?
No, it was actually published in 2011.
2011 in Polish.
Yes, and this was around the same time that the movie In Darkness came out.
Okay. And now you're coming and publishing it in English.
Yes. So it came out on the 27th of January. It was published. And it's called Beneath the Lightless Sky. And it is my grandfather's memoir. Obviously, edits were made grammatically, so it wouldn't be just a transliteration from Polish to English. It has to sound and read well. But in it, the essence, the substance, it's all there, and nothing was changed.
How did he live his life after all of this? Do you know those stories? Did your family tell you? Was he bitter? Was he sad? Was he grateful to be alive? Do you know how he lived the rest of his life?
I think he lived the rest of his life with love for his family. I think that he was not bitter. He looked forward, not backwards. He wanted to get on with his life, and what was important to him were his children and ultimately his grandchildren, up until the time that he passed. I know that he was an intense person. That I do remember. So there was some effect. How could there not be? But, he was definitely affected, traumatized by what happened. And so I remember that when he ate food off of a plate, you have the meat and you have the starch and you have the vegetables, he would never take a bite of each and work his way around. He would always finish one. He would finish the meat and then go to the potatoes, let's say, finish the potatoes and go to the vegetables. I do remember that. I didn't understand at the time why he ate that way, but that obviously has something to do with trauma.
So you're retired now and you're publishing his book in English. What brought you to that decision now? Why are you bringing it forward now?
So that's a good question. Originally, after reading the translation of his book, his memoir, I knew that something came over me. I had a calling. Once I read it, I said, the world has to know what happened, and they have to know this story. And I think that since the movie was already out, the best way to tell the story was through a TV series. So I set out to develop a television series, which I'm still working on. But one of the best ways to get a TV series off the ground is to have a literary piece of work, a book, per se, a story that's already been written. And of course, this story has a lot of good traction. My mother's book was a bestseller, The Girl in the Green Sweater, and then that inspired the movie In Darkness, directed by Agnieszka Holland, which was an Academy Award nominated feature film for Best Foreign Language film in 2011, 2012. So this story has a lot of traction, and now with the Beneath the Lightless Sky, that kind of bookends the movie, and I'd like to have that turned into a television series. And we sat here for well over 2 hours and discussing some of the points in the book. There's no way you can tell this entire story in a feature film length of time. The characters are so rich, and some of them are diabolical. Ignacy's character, Leopold Socha's character, and everybody else along the way. It has to be told in a series format. That's the way you develop it. And then you tell the story of the Holocaust through this family. This is a story about a family. This is not, corpses lined up in front, black and white. This is a story of the family. And that's how people will be educated about the atrocities of the Holocaust, because they will embed themselves in this family's life, and they will understand what they went through and live their lives through this family, love them, fall in love with Ignacy and Paulina, Christina and Pavel, just like Leopold Socha did, and also fall in love with Leopold Socha, who is a hero in his own way. So this is the best way to teach the story, the situation that happened, the Holocaust, what Jews went through, how horrible it was. It's through a personal connection. And the only way to do that, I think, the best way to do that is through a television series.
Before I get to my last question, is there something important to his story that we've left out that we should bring up at this point?
I think we've touched upon almost everything. One of the, let's say this, I know that he does make a point of this, and he tries to still, after all of the horror that he saw, tries to see if these people were still humans. There was a chapter, are they humans or are they jackals? That's the question he asks. How can a man turn to be such an animal? How can humanity break down? I think he tries to touch upon that. I think he wants to understand how human beings could treat each other so heinously.
Yeah, in this story you see choice being there, right? You choose to be the things you choose. And he chose where his heart, I feel, was telling him to choose. And thank God for that. If you could have people remember one thing about your grandfather, Ignacy Chiger, what would you want them to remember about him?
That's a difficult question. There's so many choices. I think for the love of family, for the love of human beings, and also for his sense of humor. Throughout the entire ordeal, he still had a sense of humor. When they were putting on satirical plays in the sewer, trying to be human beings, he still had a sense of humor.
So, Doron, where can people find the book, find out more information about your family? Where can they connect?
So I have an Instagram account at Beneath the Lightless Sky. The book is available on Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, Beneath the Lightless Sky. Now that the book is published, it's getting a lot of traction. The story's getting traction. I'm available to speak, in person and over digital media. I think that this is one of those stories that's a little bit different.
Yeah, I think by learning about your grandfather, we learn perhaps more about our own lives.
100%.
Doron, thank you for being with me today. I'll have all the information down in the show notes for the people to link to. So I wish you and your family all the best.
Thank you. And thanks for having me on.